I will never vote to give Washington, D.C. separate statehood status. Washington, D.C. is a city, not a state. Its population is roughly 1/7 that of Alabama.
The sons and daughters of Washington, D.C. laid down their life for this country in world wars. They stand for this country in service to this government. Why are we denying them their right?
So this is not about voting. This is about altering the makeup of the House and the Senate. This is a continuation of the efforts by the Democrats to alter the way America operates.
For more than 2 centuries, the residents of Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia, have been denied their right to fully participate in their democracy.
Welcome to another installment of Pros and Cons. Today we're asking the question, should D.C. be the 51st state of America? You decide.
I support D.C. statehood because it has to do with representation in government. Second, giving the people who live in D.C. a right to govern as a state. And third, creating legislation that helps the people of D.C. The people who live in D.C. are eligible to vote, they have electoral college votes, they can enlist in the military, and they pay federal taxes. And above all, they're Americans. And when you think about it, this is extremely important because we're living in a global pandemic, and having representation, especially at the federal level, is extremely important. For example, when we passed the HEROES Act in May of 2020, who was there advocating for the people who live in DC? The answer is no one. And that's extremely important because the whole purpose of our government was to make sure that people, regardless of where they lived, had that representation, and we're taking that away from the citizens of DC. So we should right that wrong. We should make DC a state for the basic reason that they will have representation as a government in the federal government with senators and representatives. Second of all, when DC becomes a state, we'll give them a right to govern as a state. This is extremely important because when we learn in our civics class and our different classes in schools that there are 2 separate types of powers. There's the powers of the federal government and there's the powers of the state government. And there are special powers delegated to the state government. For example, the power to control the police force, the Black Lives Matter protests, and, the insurrection that happened on Capitol Hill on, January 6th. Maybe if DC was a state, the governor could have called in the state police force, and maybe those situations could have been prevented. But they weren't, because DC is not a state. And that's just one example of the special powers that states do have. Because let's be real, the insurrection, who was supposed to be protecting everyone? It was the National Guard. Who controls the National Guard? The federal government. Beyond those 2 situations, you think about education. DC has their own school system. Who's putting the education requirements? It's not people who live in DC. It's, other people. And, the people of DC have a right to govern as a state. Lastly, creating legislation that helps DC. We all know that DC is a approximation to Maryland and Virginia, both of which have very different laws than, probably a place like DC. And when you think about it, if I go a couple miles out, there's healthcare that's very, very different than the healthcare that is in DC. And while that might seem small to people who don't live in DC, that plays a big aspect into those people who reside in DC because they don't have the same legislation or laws that that govern them versus other states. And they should have the ability to create legislation that helps their community and uplifts their community. If they realize that a certain problem is very, very big in DC, they should have the ability to create legislation that can solve that problem. But as of right now, they can't do that because they're not a state. Many of my opponents who believe that DC should not be a state believe that it's a political ploy for Democrats to get more seats in the House and the Senate, which is not necessarily true. Because regardless of what the people in DC believe in, this is a matter of representation and making sure that all those citizens who reside in DC, who are predominantly Black and brown, have the ability to partake in the fundamental rights of our government, which is representation and being able to create laws and legislation that pertain to them. And this is not an issue of partisanship, whether it's Democrats or Republicans. This is a people issue. We are stripping away a fundamental right that people have that was the basis of our whole entire government. And that's wrong. We should be able to create DC as a state, not because of political ploy, but so that people in DC can advocate for themselves and represent themselves.
I do not support the statehood of the District of Columbia. I do not support it because the district is not well equipped to become a state. Simply put, it is small, with a sole major economic output. The city is only the 20th largest in the nation, and would be one of the least populated states despite being incredibly dense and a major population center on the East Coast. It would be the smallest state by area, and by a lot. The district is 18 times smaller than the current smallest state in the Union by area, which is Rhode Island. Admitting small states is also a thing of the past. 7 of the 10 smallest states in the Union were part of the original 13 colonies, including Rhode Island itself. Even still, the smallest states have diverse economies, land, and resources. DC has none of these. Nearly 1/3 of Washington's working-age population is employed in a government agency. In contrast, that number for the total United States working-age population is only 1%. This one industry area that comprises a single city should never become its own state. The small area does deserve federal representation, however, but it's laughable to consider it as its own state. Secondly, the plays to make DC a state are very deeply rooted in partisan politics. The movement draws support exclusively from Democrats, and that's not for no reason. The district cast 92% of all presidential ballots for Joe Biden in 2020 and has never cast its electoral votes for a Republican candidate. This trend will likely continue, and if admitted, DC will consistently elect 2 Democratic senators, a Democratic member to the House of Representatives, and a Democratic governor. It should be crystal clear why partisan-oriented Democrats are pushing for statehood. However, some Democrats are very wary about this blatant and obvious push for power. Representatives for West Virginia's moderate Democratic Senator, Joe Manchin, stressed the fact that he was not on board with DC statehood. Proponents of DC statehood claim to be for proper representation, yet they reject compromises that provide representation without the blatant power grab. The District of Columbia was originally 10 miles by 10 miles with land on both sides of the Potomac River. This included cities like Alexandria in Virginia. That is because in 1846, Virginia retroceded or took back the land that they originally gave up for the District of Columbia. Citizens of Alexandria, Virginia, now enjoy representation in the terms of electing Virginia governors, Virginia senators, and members of the House of Representatives to represent the state of Virginia. Maryland, if they were to copy this move, which they should, would be making the perfect compromise. It would follow the current statehood proposal of shrinking the actual District of Columbia to only encompass federal buildings with no residents and revoking the district's 3 electoral votes. Instead of unnecessarily and partisanly creating the 51st state, it would incorporate the land back into the state of Maryland as it once was, and the citizens of Washington would become like the citizens of those in Alexandria, although that they would represent the state of Maryland instead of the state of Virginia. This grants representation without any of the partisan fluff. The proposal is the one to back for those who are purely focused on the representation of district residents, and it is clear why Senate and congressional Democrats, at least most of them, do not support it because they are not only for the representation of the district. The city of government deserves to be placed back in Maryland. They do not deserve to be their own state. They cannot be their own state because they are unfit. This is why I cannot support DC statehood, and this is why you shouldn't either.